19th session of the public hearing on the comprehensive permit for housing development at 582 Blue Hill Avenue. This meeting's being recorded. My name is Jeffrey Mullen. Today is June 23rd, and I'm the acting chair. With me are Giselle Joffer and Frank O'Brien, both members. I see the applicant is here. The counsel to the neighborhood group is here. So let me get through with some preliminaries. I apologize for the cancellation of last week's hearing. I realize that time is short, and as the applicant has said, he needs to keep the board's feet to the fire. I can assure him that they are, and we are working as hard as we can within the resources that are available to us to conclude this hearing, believe me. Last week's cancellation was unavoidable due to the situation with the legislature and the availability of the remote process. The Board of Appeals intends to continue this hearing remotely for as long as it is possible to do so, consistent with the law and the desires of the full board and the town of Milton. But I've been instructed and advised by the chair of this board, John Leonard, that remote hearings are the policy of the board until we hear otherwise. So it's my expectation that we'll be able to conclude this hearing remotely. If anybody who is wondering, I know several people wrote to the board expressing their desire to continue this remotely. I appreciate that. I too think that the remote participation has been a good government experience, a good government experiment. I'm a former government official myself, and I appreciate what we've all been through. I will share with you that at the beginning, I was not in favor of complicated hearings remotely, but I think this has actually gone quite well. And my observation is that we've got a robust participation, and people have been able to follow along quite nicely. And in particular, I appreciate the use of the electronic means to share the graphics, which I think is always a little bit of a problem in a public setting. And, you know, we've all experienced that, whether it be a town hall or the Milton Senior Center. So more on that. I mean, enough on that, but I personally am bullish on it. And I believe the chair of the Board of Appeals is as well. So for anybody who thinks that we're not in favor of continuing that, I just wanted to put that to rest. So thank you for weighing in, and thank you all for participating in this process, which I know can be tiring. Secondly, I know the other day on Monday we got a letter from Mr. Schumer on behalf of the applicant. Thank you. A letter's been entered into the record. I'll let the letter speak to itself, but I'll invite the Mr. Schumer in a minute to speak to aspects of that if he would like. I think one takeaway is that we will not be receiving a construction management plan as we had requested. I consider that important for people to know, and don't want people to miss that. So that's going to be perhaps more discussion on that. Let's see. The other issue is the applicant is requesting a condition on resolving the issue of site control, citing a case. I haven't read it yet, but that I think was an important issue. And the applicant has also submitted a revised waiver, a revised matrix of several waivers from the town's bylaws, which I've gone through briefly, but we're going to need some more time to do that. So I'd like to reserve some time to go over that. And I also want to hear from the town officials. So for example, Mr. Schumer, I continue to not understand why you need relief from the bylaw permitting you to get into town ways, given the fact that Blue Hill Avenue is a state highway, and we're not dealing with the issue of Meeting House Lane. So I want to hear more about that, and I think would like to hear from the town officials, the police chief, and the DPW director, and Mr. Zawinski. So I only use that as an example because that was the first one on the list. I know it was 10 or so pages, and I'll as soon as I have time and the members have time, we'll go through that. But we'll reserve some time within the period of time we have remaining to speak to that. Let me say tonight we intended to hear from the applicant on the stormwater, sewer, drainage, and other updates from the applicant. I intended to hear testimony from the town's peer reviewer, Mr. Reardon, who I know will be delayed until 7:30 at the earliest, and we intended to hear some testimony from town officials. Now, I just learned at the top of the meeting that Mr. Berkeley's not available. I do think we need to hear from him live. So I'll want to make some time at a future hearing to hear from Mr. Berkeley. I think we owe that to him and to the applicant, given the extensive infrastructure issues that we've talked about. So the reason I'm saying that is that we're running short on time. This hearing is due to be concluded on July 21st, which means we've only got 3 or 4 sessions left. So I don't know that it's appropriate to talk about it now, but it could be that we may need to extend that date. I'm not asking for an extension at this point, but I want to keep that top of mind. And the last thing I want to say before I ask Mr. Schumer to speak is we are expecting neighbors' testimony next Wednesday, which, depending upon the outcome of this hearing, we could move to the following week. My point with the neighbors is I want to give them an opportunity to speak once they've heard all of the testimony, so that they don't have to speak again to issue some type of, would it be sir rebuttal, perhaps, Ms. Joffer? Is that what we would call that? I don't know. That's not my area. But I think the point is made. So that's what we're expecting tonight. Let me ask the members if they've got anything they'd like to add to that those introductory comments.
Nothing
Mr.
here,
O'Brien.
Nothing here, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Joffer.
I just have a quick question. Would you mind repeating the current deadline?
At the request of the applicant, the 180-day period was extended to July 1st. We approved that on May 26th.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Schumer?
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board.
Good evening.
By way of update for the board members, there was an unfortunate delay in the hearing last week, but we fortunately made good use of that time. And we had a working group session with Mr. Bomer, with Mr. Reardon.
Mr. Chair, there's an echo. Our technical person, take a look at the sound issues.
Yeah. Hopefully somebody's coming back. And the team can acknowledge the second.
I don't hear that, but I mean, it's my echo.
There we go. We're all set now.
Okay, there we are. Thank you.
Mr. Schumer.
Thank you. Perhaps that was the universe's way of providing a counterpoint to your favorable comments regarding the use of Zoom, Mr. Chair. But be that as it may.
We're all learning together. I look forward to a presentation at the Transportation Research Board in Washington, D.C. next January on this.
To continue, Mr. Chair, we had a working group session with Mr. Bomer and Mr. Reardon last week. I would describe it as extremely productive. We got in a Zoom room and hashed out a lot of issues on the site civil issues, the drainage, the sewer issues, as well as design. And some ideas came out of that meeting that our engineer is tracking down some further investigations, and I'll turn it over to him in a few minutes. But, and I'll leave it to Mr. Reardon to speak for himself regarding his impression of the status of that. But my understanding is that he will be submitting a letter shortly with the board, and hopefully we'll hear some comments from him tonight regarding the infrastructure on the site. And my understanding is that for the most part, the substantial issues are resolved between the engineers. And so you'll hear some further comment from him tonight. On that, our investigation.
I'm sorry, Mr. Schumer, let me just ask you, out of respect for Mr. Reardon and the fact that he's not there, maybe we could postpone any conversation about the stormwater and the drainage until after he's able to join, time permitting. I'm not going to hold up the rest of the hearing, but We'll just be mindful of that if you don't mind.
Certainly, yeah, I
Okay.
think that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you.
Certainly. Regarding the site design and architecture, and this again, Cliff can speak for himself on this, but we hashed out some ideas regarding some alternative layouts on the site, and specifically an idea that Cliff had to shift around some of the massing on the north building at the front of the site to open up the presentation of the historic mansion house to Meeting House Lane, and also to widen the access driveway in that area. Our team did sketch out that idea in two different forms, and in a nutshell, the way to achieve that would be either to shift the mass that was at that location to the west building, and some of it to the rear of the north building, or to put all of the mass on the top of both buildings. And when we sketched out those alternative plans, in our view, the existing plan is preferable. And I'll let Dan Riggs go into that in a moment. Regarding the site access driveway that Mr. Bomer had suggested we take a look at tinkering with, we did take a look at widening that, but unfortunately, due to the topography and the area that we have to deal with, the proposal to widen that would not enable us to achieve full access around that front entry circle for the largest fire vehicles in the town of Milton. And the recommendation from our team, and Bob Michaud of MDM Transportation is on the line tonight, he can speak further on this, is that the current design on that as well is also preferable, because there's no need for full fire access in the circle, and the turnaround geometry that he has provided, it allows for fire access to come into the circle, pull in and pull out in reverse. And the additional issue with the front access driveway was, we were looking at trying to achieve whether we could provide better access for delivery vehicles and larger box trucks and things of that nature. MDM's Transportation, their recommendation was that we leave the circle as is, for the reason that the dedicated loading space that was designed at the front of the site is a preferable location for that, both because it provides a specific place for those vehicles to go, but more importantly, because it requires them to exit the site through the south driveway rather than through the north driveway, which reduces the likelihood of conflicts at the Delphi intersection and intersections farther up on that side of the site. So we do have some revisions that came out of the working session. As I said, I think it was a very productive meeting, and I'll turn it over to Dan to talk about some of the revisions that they've made and what they're going to be doing going forward. So that's by way of update from us, Mr. Chair.
Okay, before we hear from Mr. Riggs, Mr. Schomer, when you say submit to the board, what's your timing, given my comments about the pressure that we're under to conclude this hearing?
The changes that we're proposing at this point, Mr. Chair, I would say are very, very minor things, and I would say they're more along the lines of housekeeping matters. They have to do with things such as accessibility, the arrangement for trash collection around the site, and things of that nature. And so we would anticipate filing that as part of the final plans for this project.
I'm trying to square the comment on a successful working session with the fact that there are only minor and not any substantial changes to the plan. Is that what I'm to understand is happening?
Well, I think it was successful in the sense that we did talk about a number of things. From our perspective, the larger big picture items that were discussed at the working session, we put pencil to paper. We tried to see if they would work, and in our view, they didn't work. But I still think it was a very successful session, because we got on the same page, I think, on a number of issues between site civil and architecture. And I think we're definitely moving in the right direction in terms of ticking boxes and taking things off the list of things that still need to be done. I think ultimately we may get to the point where we're as close as possible between the architects and the engineers with an agreement. in terms of the approach. And at that point, when we get to the point where we're as close as possible, we'll leave it in the board's hands to make determinations regarding appropriate conditions for the project.
Mr. Riggs.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to start, I think going off of what Jesse had just mentioned, there are a few changes that we are planning on incorporating into the design. An enlarged play area is part of that, as well as continuing to coordinate our architectural drawings with the civil engineering drawings as those are finalized. With that, I can defer to Bob Michaud for some of the transportation issues. And if the board would care to see, I can bring you through some of the sketches that we produced based on the feedback from that peer review working session, if you'd like to see those.
I'm interested in two specific things. I don't know if you need to share the screen to do that, but at the last meeting, Mr. McGrath asked a question about how the trash plan was going to work, and we deferred that to a later session. I thought that was a fair question, and it didn't seem like we had the right people or the right information. So I'm interested in the answer to that question. And at the last hearing, Ms. Joffer made a comment about how some of the smaller details that we discussed early on in the plan at the first generation of this have seemed to have gotten lost in some of the larger issues. And I want to respect Ms. Joffer's point, and I want to return to that at some point, whether that's now or whether that's Mr. Riggs, you, or Mr. Michaud, I don't know, but I will say that those are two things that my notes indicate we want to close up. Otherwise, if there are modifications to the plans that the board has seen, I'm interested in seeing them. If they're not, I don't know that that's necessary. So I'll leave it to the applicant to decide.
Absolutely, yeah. No modifications created yet that the board has seen. So,
okay.
In terms of the trash management, I know our client has started to broach that topic. I don't know if Jesse or Joe, you guys would like to answer that question.
I can speak further to that, Daniel. Mr. Chair, regarding the issue of trash access, we will be supplementing the site plans with a sketch showing the location, the prospective location of where we anticipate trash to be handled. And without putting something up on the screen at the moment, the location that we have in mind is the access doorway for maintenance coming out of the north building garage, which is at the bottom of that building. And the proposal that we would have is to submit for a condition of approval of the project that there would be a comprehensive trash management plan that would be filed with the town prior to construction, prior to certificates of occupancy, that outlines specifically how it'll work, when trash will be collected. And then at the appropriate time, once the trash collector is selected, we obviously at this point, it's a little early to have made that decision. We would notify the Board of Health and make sure that they're on board with the proposed arrangement. The trash room within the garage, I understand, is somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 square feet. It's been designed to have capacity for 96 gallon trash receptacles, as well as 2 cubic yard receptacles, and they would be rolled out from that room to the location of the driveway below that north building and collected in that location. So when we would propose to submit something in writing to that effect, and then supplement the final plans with a sketch showing that, if that's acceptable to the board.
Oh, when would that be?
I can do that by the end of this week, Mr. Chair.
Well, let the board speak to that at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Riggs?
Absolutely, yes, Mr. Chair.
Is that the end of your testimony?
It is. I think one other additional thing to add is that I know Jim Burke had looked at some additional accessibility measures for the site, specifically connecting from Blue Hill Avenue back to the front entry of the building. So that's part of the accessibility measures that we had looked to kind of supplement and continue looking at. So barring that, that's the end of my testimony. And thank you.
Mr. Schumer, is there anything else the applicant would like to add in the way of updates?
I think with leaving to the side the issues of stormwater, I think that's it for us for now. I had in mind that Dan would talk about the sketches, but it sounds like from what you're saying, Mr. Chair, you'd prefer not to see those. They were really just conceptual sketches that showed potential ways to achieve Mr. Bomer's idea, but as I said before, we've decided that we feel that the present layout is better.
Well, I don't want to dictate what the applicant shows. If the board's pleasure is to see them, fine. Personally, I'm concerned about the number of plans that we've seen, and I don't want to cause any confusion. I'm interested, perhaps Mr. Bomer would have a recommendation for the board as to whether or not that's a worthy line of inquiry. You've heard the testimony and the results of the working session. Do you have anything you'd like to share with the board right now?
I think the only thing I would add, and actually I have seen them, the sketches that explored the options that we talked about at the working session. And I think the only question I have is that, well, and I do want to point out that I do agree with Mr. Schumer's characterization of it being productive. It definitely was a productive working session. But I think I would just like to hear them speak to all of the studies that were shown. I do agree with their conclusions from the studies, but they did choose to hold the unit count as a constant. So, as a fixed variable in all of the studies. And I think it's important to at least understand why that approach was taken. I don't think that was stated at the working session, that the studies should hold the unit count as a constant. It was more about look at opening up the views to the building and everything that Mr. Riggs stated. So I'm curious of why that was done that way, of holding that variable constant.
Mr. Schumer.
The decision on that, Mr. Chair and Mr. Bomer, that's an economic decision. At this point, we've made significant reductions to the site and undertaken the significant cost of preserving the existing mansion and the existing gardens. So we're at the point where this is the limit for us. 86 units and the parking layout and count. That's our limit. That's effectively where we're saying we're drawing the line on this. So economics is what it comes down to.
I think it'd be helpful to see the sketches just for the context, and people are listening and have no idea what we're talking about, nor do I actually.
I think it is, and you'll see also, Mr. Chair, that they did expand the play space too, which I think was a good move.
Let's put them up and speak to them.
Sure thing. Here, let me bring you through this. Apologize for my dog barking. So just to start out again, as Mr. Bomer mentioned and Mr. Schumer mentioned, we did hold to the program count, the number of units, number of parking spaces, gross square footage, and that was a thing that we're holding as a constant, as Mr. Bomer had mentioned. Just to orient you on where the sketches will be taken from, this is again the aerial that we had shown you previously, looking sort of south. South is sort of page at the top of the page here. So again, the entry court of the development, Blue Hill Avenue, running here, the north building and our west building, existing house, and the historic garden. So just to orient you on where these shots will be taken from. So this first view is looking at sort of the area that we looked at, which is this extension of the north building, sort of the northwestmost wing, not to throw too many cardinal directions at you, but the northwest wing of the north building, looking to reduce the area there, increase views towards the existing historic structure, and potentially look to open up that courtyard area. So that study area really incorporates 12 units within the development. It's 3 units per floor and 4 floors. So again, that's that focus area shown on the plan. And again, keeping the program as it is, the garage continues up along that corner to this point here, and then continues back towards the west building. So our first review topic or way of understanding how to deal with that, the 12 unit sort of shift, or where to put those 12 units once we remove them from that location and expanded views towards that courtyard. So we looked at it 2 different ways, and this is the first way, was to take 2 of those units and sort of eliminate one of the setbacks we had towards the rear on Meeting House Lane. Here, keeping this 3-story reed for the final portion of that building as it approaches Meeting House Lane, and adding 10 units to the west building as it approaches Blue Hill Avenue here, which would involve some cutting back of the existing tree growth along Blue Hill Avenue, but does open up some views towards the existing home. And a plan view of that. So this is again that sort of deleted area here. We're adding 2 units to the rear of the north building as it approaches Meeting House Lane, and adding the other 10 units to this portion of the west building. This is our second sketch, so the review topic 2, I'm calling it. So this was basically taking those 12 units that were removed from the north building where they had been here, again, allows the opening of views towards the existing house, and then relocating those 12 units, so relocating 6 of them to the rear of the north building, sort of completing the volume of the north building, if you will. And then another 6 units are added as an additional floor to the west building. And here you can see that in plan view, this option maintains the current front buffer here. It sort of has the least amount of plan impact, but it has the most amount of height impact in terms of how that west building would be perceived from Blue Hill Avenue. So those are some of the kind of trade-offs that we were looking at within these options, and again, keeping the program as a constant. And that's the final slide there. I can leave this up if that's helpful, or
Well, let me ask one question. Is there a perspective of the view of the west, the taller west building from Blue Hill Avenue? I understand it would be taller, but can you actually, did you show what the people on the ground would see?
we haven't gone to the lengths of exploring it fully in terms of creating perspective drawings in that
Yeah.
sense.
Is it taller than the trees?
I don't believe it would be taller than the trees. I don't have a precise measurement on the trees, but this would add about 12 feet to the top height of the building, and would probably include mechanical equipment on top of that addition. So just for a full height of the building there, I believe it was 47 feet exposure there. So it would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 58 to 59 feet of building height at that point.
Plus mechanicals.
Plus the mechanicals, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let me ask my members of the board if they've got any questions on Mr. Riggs, thank you. Can you make sure that Ms. Sutton or Mr. Zawinski get this for the record, and we can enter it formally into the record? And then I'll ask, thank you. And Mr. O'Brien or Ms. Joffrey, if you've got any questions of the applicant on this presentation at this time.
Mr. Chair, I have a
Ms.
question.
Joffrey.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Bomer. And my question, Mr. Chair, is whether he agrees that the current design is, I think, preferable in terms of utility and environmental impact when compared to the other 2 designs that Mr. Riggs just proposed. And if he is in agreement, whether he still believes that his original suggestion be followed, even if it requires a unit reduction, just setting economics aside, but with respect to footprint.
And that's a really, I think that's really at the heart of the issue. That's why I brought up what's being held as the fixed variable. The part of my concerns from the beginning have been making sure that the architectural design issues are in step with the civil engineering issues. And I think, you know, there's been a lot of changes made on the stormwater side, and which was why that working session was set up the way it was, where both civil engineer and architectural reviews were coordinated. So my concerns were linked to essentially maybe an intensity of use that might not work. And the intensity of use, the metric, I think probably the best metric for intensity of use on this site actually was the stormwater management issue. So as that has gotten, and Sean Reardon will speak for himself, but that certainly is getting closed in on, I think, from a technical perspective. So from my perspective, decreasing the unit count is not a bad thing because it builds some slack into the system. It builds just the ability, if things don't go quite as calculated, there will be some slack in the system for dealing with stormwater issues in particular. I don't think traffic is really going to emerge as a controlling issue on this development. So from my perspective, it's we're at a point where some very small details could make very big differences. I think the notion of creating greater exposure for the historic home, I think there is value to that. It isn't even necessarily consistent with the historic, with the historic perspective of the house. Right now, there is not a huge view of the house. I think my feeling was, from an architectural perspective and from the quality of what that courtyard would be like, if there was value in shortening that west wing of the north building. And I appreciate the fact that these studies were done. I do think, knowing that and I'll let Sean speak for himself again, the other concern I had about that constricted space was drop off, the ability for delivery, drop off, as well as emergency vehicle access to that site. If those technical elements have been worked out, I think it's the notion of a kind of almost surprise that you see when you get to the historic home in a small, intimate courtyard that really only needs to be accessed by people that might be dropped off, as opposed to any emergency vehicles. I think from a design perspective, it could work very well, as long as the building's well designed, the materials are well chosen. So I think it can work. I really do. I think it was a very good question about the perspective views from Blue Hill Avenue to see what kind of impact it really would make. But I think those were legitimate studies, as long as the technical issues are well worked out, particularly the drop off and emergency vehicle and stormwater issues. I'm feeling confident that this could be developed into a nice project. So I think that's my position. It's come an awful long ways. And I think if the resources really are, as Mr. Schumer suggested, if the resources really are being concentrated in a proper preservation of those historic elements, most importantly, probably the historic garden, I think that's a reasonable allocation of resources.
Ms. Joffer,
Thank you. That was helpful.
Mr. O'Brien, You're on mute, Mr. O'Brien. It's 2021. You're still on mute.
I'm a slow learner, Mr. Chairman.
20th hearing, still on mute.
Mr. Chairman, I think I'll wait for the drainage portion to ask my questions. Thank you.
Fair enough. Barrett, is there anything you'd like to add? Mr. Schomer, putting the stormwater and drainage issues aside, does that conclude your update?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chair.
Mr.
Thank you.
Barrett, is there anything you'd like to add at this point to the board? Okay, you all set? Oh, okay. Mr. Zawinski, can you, on behalf of the town, speak to the persons who are available tonight to offer input to the board on the application?
Yes, I can, Mr. Chair. I'm gonna
Thank you.
actually, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I'm gonna pop into the attendees list real quick and see, we've got, and Bev, if you can elevate these folks, we've got John Kiernan from the Conservation Commission. We have Steve O'Donnell from the Historical Commission in the attendees, if you could elevate those folks.
Okay, I've always seen him under a different name. And I also, Sean Reardon just was, I guess, promoted. Who else?
So
Anyone?
that's it for now. And I would ask if there's anyone else here from either a town department or board that I'm not seeing that's
raise
here to
their
testify. If
hands.
you could just raise your hand and Bev will add you to the panelists. But just as an update, Mr. Chair, I am here as I always am. And so I've been spending the past couple weeks, as you're very, very, very well aware, as the keeper of the schedule, this item of testimony has kind of jumped around a few times over the past few weeks. So it has been, through no fault of anyone's, a little bit of a tough time wrangling folks, to that effect. Yeah, to that effect, as you mentioned earlier, Chase Berkeley, the director of Public Works, is double booked tonight. He's at the select board discussing a mascot project at Randolph Ave in Chickatawbut, which is his purview as DPW director. So hopefully we can schedule. No, absolutely not. That's a big one. So we'll get him in front of the board. Chase has been excellent about offering his comments and participating in these hearings. So I have no doubt that he'll be here at a future hearing. To that effect, I did mention kind of before we went live with the meeting that I do have written comments that were passed along to me from Chief Madden of the Fire Department and Carolyn Kinsella of the Health Department. And then I did reach out to Chief King. Lieutenant Alba from the Milton Police Department had testified at an earlier hearing. His testimony and questions and comments still stand. Chief King didn't have anything additional to add. I think, as it relates to some of the traffic issues, those have not necessarily been, they've been important issues, but I think, are issues that are relatively kind of straightforward. And I think Lieutenant Alba, excuse me, has made his position clear in previous testimony. So I think with that, Mr. Chair, if you'll indulge me, if maybe we can start with Steve O'Donnell, and then if Mr. Kiernan from the Conservation Commission would like to follow Mr. O'Donnell with their comments, and then I can kind of do the remainder of the town testimony.
Terrific. Mr. O'Donnell, welcome back to thank you, Tim. Mr. O'Donnell, welcome back to the board.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board, and other hearing participants. As you know, I'm chair of the Historical Commission, and I have to say at the outset that the commission was so encouraged back in March when the applicant finally acknowledged the historical and cultural value of the building and garden on the site. They use words like focal point, grandeur, amazing detail, masterful design, rich in detail, nice variegated brick, gem of the project. words that I might have myself used to describe it. And then they lowered the boom. The design they presented totally denigrated the house and basically ignored everything they had just said. They lopped off a third of the building and attached it to and buried it under a 4-story building, which is not only higher than the house, but higher than the chimneys on the home. And now we hear there was actually discussion about putting another story on the west building, which would have projected the building even that much higher. The north building, adjacent to the bifurcated historical home, extends almost 70 feet towards off the house towards Blue Hill Avenue, and nearly as far to the rear of the house. The so-called gem of the project looks like a Lego block dropped beside the building. The house is virtually invisible except from straight in front of it. The house would be totally overshadowed, and the turnaround and entrance in front of it placed in shade virtually all the time. The Shipman Design Garden, which their words describe as having, quote, masterful design, unquote, is paralleled by a 4-story building almost 170 feet long, starting before the right end of the house and extending about 30 feet past the far end of the garden, essentially putting both the house and garden into a 4-story box. The rear garden wall will be removed. If the garden is to be preserved, there needs to be guarantees and arrangements to ensure this going forward. Will there be an endowment to ensure preservation going forward? Will there be an easement deeded to a conservation organization? The so-called redesign of the project still completely ignores the intensity of use of the property. The applicant seems to feel that they're some sort of hero by reducing the number of units by 25%. But when you start with a project that is so outrageously, offensively large in the beginning, that reduction is better described as a step in the right direction. It's also very possible that the demolition of part of the existing house and construction of the underground garage right next to it may compromise the foundation of the house. And again, construction of the underground garage, essentially right up against the garden, may well compromise it also. Of course, we don't know how practical their plans are, or even if they're able to build what they propose, because they refuse to provide details or a construction management plan. I won't spend time on the water issues. There are plenty of others to address those, except to say that the earth moving alone required in order to try to provide means of handling the surface and subsurface water may well itself adversely impact the stability of the building and garden. This whole thing is a classic example of designing a building and then trying to shoehorn it into a site, rather than starting with the site and seeing what it will support. Reducing the amount of impervious surface and elimination of the underground garage would inevitably help solve the water issue. And reducing the number of units would help accomplish this. But as Mr. Bowman says, that's the one item that apparently is not on the table. This parcel is large enough to provide additional housing units designed in a manner sensitive and respectful to the existing building and garden, as well as the surrounding neighborhood. Expansion of the building and/or addition of other appropriately sized structures, drawing on the elements of design that mirror the existing property, would create increased density on the site, as well as making the project more attractive to the market rate tenants who would make up the majority of the residents who might wish to live in this environment. This can be done, should be done, and has been done. In fact, has been done by this applicant, whose website ironically showcases at least 4 instances in other towns where they have done exactly that, updating and renovating an existing historic and significant building and adding similar adjacent sympathetic construction. Their website describing one project says, and I quote, The thoughtfully planned layout preserves the site's stunning natural beauty and history while providing much needed new housing. Why can't they do this in Milton? So the applicant has told us that they want to save most of the building and the garden, but provided a design that totally diminishes their importance and significance. When asked how certain elements, accessibility, trucking, trash, snow, state and federal water issues, dewatering during construction, and in fact, construction management issue, etc., they say they'll do it later, that they anticipate, plan to, expect to do all kinds of things later. Words are cheap. If the applicants had spent the last 6 months trying to present a respectful, responsible, reasonable, and realistic project, instead of tweaking a flawed and still grossly oversized plan, which may in fact prove unbuildable on this site, we'd be much further along in the process of getting approval. The bottom line here is that despite the verbiage of the applicant, the present plan evidences little by way of preservation in the true sense of the word. The building and gardens appear as afterthoughts on the plan, retained in such fashion simply so that they can say they preserve them. Words are cheap. The applicant is unable or unwilling to provide any evidence or assurance that they can in fact build what they're proposing, and may in fact, while trying, may actually compromise or destroy that which they say they are preserving. As Mr. Bowman has stated, the board needs to know the basic feasibility of this plan and that this project as currently presented can actually be built on this site. Short of that demonstration, which the applicant is unwilling to provide, the board should not approve this project. In any event, we would ask the board to deny the 2 waiver requests most onerous to the commission. The waiver from Chapter 8 asking for a waiver to, quote, remove any and all trees and or stone walls, which could potentially totally denude the site, which they're practically doing in order to try to deal with the water, and would presumably include the stone wall along Blue Hill Avenue at the front of the property. Second waiver is from Chapter 22, demolition of historically significant buildings. There is also the requirement for the applicants filing a project notification form with the Massachusetts Historical Commission. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell, for that thoughtful letter. Ms. Joffer or Mr. O'Brien, questions?
No questions for me, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to thank Mr. O'Donnell and his fellow Historic Commission members for their efforts.
Thank you.
Just one question, which I'm sure I can look at in the letter, but what was the second waiver that you requested the board to deny?
The demolition of historically significant buildings, Chapter 22 of the Milton bylaws.
Thank you.
I don't have any questions, Mr. O'Donnell. I wonder if the town's peer reviewer has a question or anything to add at this point.
No, I think that I appreciate that very much, and I think that a couple of the comments, and I think I am a little bit at variance with Attorney Schumer's discussion or opinion on the construction management plan, and I think maybe I'm sympathetic with not talking about construction management plans per se, but certainly basic feasibility issues really matter. All of you have spent however many hearings it is at this point, and I think at this point it's totally legitimate to want to know that what you're being shown is actually feasible. And I did want to point out, I was just looking at my notes from the working session on the 17th, certainly the tree preservation, really believing that the trees that are cited for saving can actually be saved matters. It really does. That's a significant design aspect of this project that I think you really need to know whether it's going to work or not. But I'm looking, I haven't read the letter. I'm not sure when the letter got submitted from Mr. O'Donnell, but I would like to read it in more detail too.
Thank you, Mr. Bomer. Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Let's see. Mr.
Mr. Chair?
Kiernan. Ms. Joffer.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Mr. Chair. Will we also be hearing from the town's Conservation Commission?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're about to, no, Mr. Kiernan?
Oh, there.
And thank you very much. I actually missed some of the discussion.
You've got a tough echo, Mr. Kiernan.
I do indeed. And I wish I could correct that. Try it again.
You have your phone on, maybe?
No, I don't have a phone.
Yeah. Well, maybe if you want to maybe
I'll leave and try to
leave
connect.
and try, and in the meantime, we'll go back to Mr. Zawinski, who could offer testimony on behalf of Ms. Kinsella and the fire chief. I will say, Tim, I don't think we heard from Lieutenant Alba. It might be written testimony from the police department, but I know him, and I don't think he's appeared in front of us.
I could be mixing up the Canton Ave hearing with this one. And if I have, I apologize.
It's okay. Let's just make sure that the police department's position is on the record. I don't know that we need to hear, personally from Mr. Alba, but I just want to make sure that we square that corner.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I have, solicited the police department, for comments, and I'll confirm if they have anything that they want to submit in writing. We'll get that to the board.
Thank you.
So on the health director's comments, she just asked me to reiterate some of the comments that she had made on behalf of the Board of Health in a letter that's dated April 21st, 2021. That should be in the town comments folder. If it's not, we'll make sure that it is. And a lot of the comments that Ms. Kinsella has, deal with kind of the construction period and kind of beyond, which, as it's a subject for discussion and debate at the board as we speak about construction management plans. But I think just for the sake of having them on the record, she's asked that, prior to excavation demolition, the owner shall strategize to eliminate pest activity on site and prevent off-site migration, and hire a licensed pest control operator to assess the property and develop a pest control plan. I'm not sure if that's something that is a reasonable condition to put it on an approval, but this is a very, very, very typical thing for multifamily development in the town of Milton and beyond. Also, to maintain covered dumpsters on site to mitigate rodent activity, which again I know that we're. I think if I understood Mr. Riggs earlier, we'll be getting a little bit more of a detailed trash plan, especially in response to some questions from Mr. McGrath. They requested pedestrian-friendly sidewalk access on both sides of the driveway that encircles the perimeter of the building. As I was looking at the plans earlier today, just as a refresher, I'm not sure if that kind of exists right now. I'll in my comments, we'll probably reprise this and maybe we can have a conversation about the sidewalk situation. They request no smoking or vaping in housing unit common areas, including inside all individual units, and that the smoking buffer zone should be at least 25 feet away from the building. This has become a big priority for the Board of Health, really trying to tamp down on smoking and vaping. And so if the applicant needs any more additional information on that, I'm sure the Board of Health can provide that. And then just a question that maybe we can kind of get answered, right now. Is there going to be a management office on site to repair sanitary code violations as they emerge during the construction period and again beyond? So those are all the points, and I think the management office question, again, both for the construction period and for the kind of, the life of the building, I think, perhaps the applicant can address that right now. Mr.
Thank-
Chair, it's your job to ask if they can address it. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine, Mr. Schumer.
Yes, I can answer that, Mr. Chair, and through you. The plan at this point, as I understand it, is that there will be, the existing house will be used as a management office temporarily during construction. So that would be the location of that.
And then building management during the kind of the functional life of the building.
Yes, there will be on-site management. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Zawinski, anything further?
Not from the health director. I do have, and Chief Madden unfortunately was out the past few days, so he wasn't able to join us tonight. But he said that that he and Steve Mataliano, who was with the fire department, who was our fire prevention officer, have both looked over the plans, understand that they're at a very basic and conceptual level or schematic level right now. I think we would all hope and expect that as the applicant kind of continues to revise and work up these drawings, that they would be in continued conversation with the fire department about some of the relevant fire prevention issues. But he said as long as they follow all applicable fire safety codes, that they'll be in good shape with the fire department. He did note that only 2 out of the 4 stairwells go down to the garage. He didn't offer additional commentary on that. My assumption is that you'll want to make sure that all of the stairwells that are in the building are going out of the building, and especially to the garage, which may be a site of potentially thorny fire issues. And then just confirmation that there'll be adequate sprinkler protection throughout the building. Those are the main issues that that Chief Madden brought up, in addition to all of his other comments and questions in previous testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Zawinski. Will you be submitting that testimony in writing?
I can absolutely do that. I'll make a note to do that right now.
Thank you. Mr. O'Brien, question?
Mr. Chairman, just a quick review as Mr. Zawinski was speaking. I did not note a submission from the Milton Police Department. There was a 5 or 6 page letter from the town dated January 19th with a number of preliminary comments. Just a quick review of what is online in the project folder. I don't see comments from the police department. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, just one further step, one further comment, and this is by in no way, shape, or form intended to be a criticism in any way to Mr. Zawinski, who has been stalwart throughout these. Color me disappointed, if you will, in the lack of participation by town officials regarding this project at this particular hearing. I hope that is rectified in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Zawinski, Ms. Joffer, anything?
Nothing, thank you.
Mr. Zawinski, anything further from town officials?
I had a few comments, actually.
Please.
And I'm going to try to be brief because I do feel like I can ramble at these things. But I did. I was reviewing some of the comments that I had made in that letter that Mr. O'Brien referenced, and just to very quickly, I can only speak for myself, but I do appreciate Mr. O'Brien's comments there. We have 4 of these projects right now, in addition to all the other town business that department heads are being asked to deal with. And so, we are doing our best, and we're always looking to encourage folks to either attend these meetings or offer their comments in writing. And so, that's my job right now. And so we'll continue to work to do that. And, Mr. O'Brien, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Joffer, at any point, if the board has specific questions for any officials that aren't here, always happy to kind of bring those back to the office and get answers. And so, again, I appreciate those comments, but I just want to just sort of reiterate that everyone's kind of doing their best right now. I went through the comments that I had written in that letter from January, and I just wanted to follow up on some questions that I had that may not have necessarily manifested themselves in revised documents that we've received. The first, and if maybe we can get an answer, tonight or in the future in writing, the number and the percentage of handicap accessible units in the project, and then the composition of those units by size, and then the percentage of accessible units that are also going to be affordable units. This was one of my first comments that I made, with that our housing production plan identifies affordable housing, obviously, as a tremendous issue in Milton, but especially for seniors and the disabled. And so, anything that this applicant can do to create as many handicap accessible units as possible, and to have as much overlap between accessible units and affordable units as possible, to make sure that folks who have disabilities and also are in need of affordable housing, have units that are available to them. And so, Mr. Chair, I don't know if you want me to go through everything and maybe, give the applicant a chance, or if you want to go one by one.
Why don't we do them all and then we'll go back, but I'll
Okay.
ask Mr. Schober to, it looks like he's gonna need to keep track. I will say it would help us to understand the breakdown composition of the 86 units. And when you break that down, I think, consider that the board has asked you to break it down with respect to accessibility and affordability. But thank you. Mr. Zawinski.
Looking at the new site plan, both the school department and myself had made a comment about a bus stop. But the school buses do not go up private drives, and so there'd be a necessity to have a pickup and drop off for school bus children on the public way. And so there is one now, which we definitely appreciate that on this site plan. One thing that I would ask, and this may be an engineering question or a landscape question, is the possibility of siting that bus stop waiting area behind the stone wall, which if I recall the plan correctly, is slated to remain. And I say that because the condition on Blue Hill Ave right now, there are no sidewalks on either side of Blue Hill Ave. Hopefully one day soon we'll have them, but not in the foreseeable future. And so, that condition on Blue Hill Ave, even if you sort of produce that, paved waiting area, it's a little bit just kind of out in the open, especially for school children. And so if there's an opportunity to sort of put that waiting area behind the existing stone wall, just to offer that, level of protection as children are waiting. And as an example, I'd ask you to maybe look, and you can visit it yourself or look at it on Street View, of the entrance to the Woodlot Drive project at the Old Town Farm, which has a waiting area for school children, which doesn't utilize an existing stone wall. It's a new kind of stone wall, but there is sort of a stone enclosure for children to wait for the bus in a safe way. So that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking of. That may have other issues for the site plan, whether it's grading or trees or whatever. But I would ask that the applicant explore that. I'll try to keep this short because I've been a broken record on bikes. Maximize bike storage. If it means vertical racks, then we'd like to see vertical racks, but we'd like to see the amount of bike storage at the maximum possible level for all the reasons that we've discussed in previous hearings. The civil plans show a sidewalk from Blue Hill Avenue up to the buildings, and it appears to sort of go around that circle, which I think is good. And there is a route from Blue Hill Avenue up to the site, to the west building, and then around the remainder of the circle to the north building. One thing that I would ask is there going to be some sort of a pavement treatment for folks that may be compelled to cross the entrance to the circle, rather than sort of going around. I don't want to use the term crosswalk because it's not necessarily the same thing, but there may be, if you want to go from the parking area that's at the entrance to the site or from Blue Hill Avenue to get to the north building, and you're not going to walk all the way around the circle to get there. Is there some sort of pavement treatment to create a safe crossing for folks? I had mentioned in my earlier comments the treatment of the building entrances from both a sort of design and kind of wayfinding perspective, but also a public safety perspective. It's really important for the entrances to the buildings to be very clear. If first responders need to get into the building, they want to be able to know exactly where to go. And then also people that are visiting the site, especially now that there's a lot more surface parking at various portions of the site, we'll want to make sure that there's some type of a treatment that, understanding that, we are in a kind of a woodier residential portion of town. We're not looking for, the marquee signage outside the Paramount Theater, but some type of either lighting or signage or planting or pavement treatment that gives a clear indication of the entrances to these buildings, because there is, the west building, kind of that elevation doesn't necessarily face the street, and then the north building, the main entrance to the new building is kind of tucked in behind the existing house. The entrance to the house is labeled as a secondary entrance. That is the most prominent looking entrance, and so I would want the applicant to kind of think about the implications of, that's the door that most people are going to see coming from the street, whether they're driving in or walking in. And if that's going to be a secondary entrance, is there a desire line that kind of points directly towards it? So those are a few issues relative to the entrances to the building. So if there are any plans for some type of lighting or planting or pavement treatment, it would be good to hear about those. I had mentioned an outdoor dog walk. This seems like a small issue, but given the nature of Blue Hill Avenue over here, and given the nature of the site, this project is taking up a significant portion of the site with either building or pavement. If folks do have pets, they're going to want to take them outside. I don't want them walking on Blue Hill Avenue, and there should be someplace on site for people with pets to be able to take them out and do whatever business they need to do, because it does become a safety issue if folks are kind of walking off site where there's no sidewalks to walk their dogs. Relative to Mr. O'Donnell's comments earlier, he's made his position very clear on this project. But I was wondering if, and I'll let his comments stand for themselves as it relates to the preservation of the gardens. I think those are important questions to answer. But I was wondering if there's going to be any sort of historical or interpretive signage or programming in the amenity areas in the existing house that talk about the history of the site, both the gardens and the house. It could be a nice touch, for residents to, kind of brand the building in a way, and give folks, an opportunity to learn a little bit more about what the site has been throughout its history. I'm swimming against the tide here in terms of parking. I don't want to. It seems like there's a lot, and if there were less, I think it would be good, and that's all I'll say. But as it relates to some of that parking, the circumferential road used to just be a road, and now there is a lot more surface parking around the entirety of the site. And what I'll ask is I know that there is pedestrian circulation on the plans. It would be helpful for either the transportation folks or the landscape folks or the engineer to kind of describe what the kind of path of travel for a pedestrian around the site is. There didn't used to be a lot of business for pedestrians around the back of the building. And now if you're going to be parking in one of those surface parking spaces, whether as a resident or as a visitor, it becomes that much more important for the pedestrian facilities to be clearly marked for the entrances to the buildings, wherever they are, on the front, side, or rear of the site to be clearly marked, and for those to be maintained in a way that makes it safe for people in all four seasons to get around. You don't want to be in a situation where you're visiting someone on the site and you're parked in the back, and all of a sudden you don't know how to get into the building. And so whether again that's through signage or pavement treatment or just an entrance in the back, it would be good to know kind of what the expected kind of path of travel for pedestrians that are kind of leaving their vehicles in the back of the site would be expected to take. So, Mr. Chair, that's all I've got for now. There were some comments in there. There were some questions in there. If you need me to kind of go back and reiterate anything, I'm happy to do it. But that's it for me for now.
No, thank you, Mr. Zawinski. Let me just state that it would be helpful to get that on the record in writing as we cobble together the recommended conditions. I'll ask the members if they've got a question for you at this point. Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sawinski, your pedestrian circulation point is well taken. And do you feel that there wasn't a sufficient exposition of that issue, or none of the graphics or the renderings provided sufficient information in that to that point?
I think from a kind of a plan perspective, everything is there. The sidewalk is there. It shows there's some places where there's stairs. There's some places where it goes around different parts of the building. I guess, and this doesn't need to be a huge production, but just it's one thing to look at a plan. It's another thing to sort of kind of walk through the scenario of, okay, I'm parked in the back of the building. How am I getting to the west building? How am I getting to the north building? It's not necessarily, there's no kind of plan for that. It's just kind of, maybe it has to be narrative. Maybe it has to be, a drawing that says, here's our signage program that says, this way to the west building, this way to the north building. I think it's an issue that at some point, it can't fall through the cracks because it is a big site. It is a big building. And especially, if you're coming in at night, obviously there's going to be security lighting around the building, or at least there should be. I have to assume that'll be something that comes up at a later stage in the development of the designs. But it's just important to know that it's something that the applicant has put thought into, I guess, is kind of the thrust of my comment there.
Thank you. It seemed like we spent a lot of time trying to figure out if a fire truck can get around the site. It didn't quite take as much time to figure out if people could. So good point. Is this typically handled in a, I guess this is a question to you, Mr. Chairman, maybe to the larger group. Is this something that's typically handled as a condition, or?
Ms. Barrett?
It can be. Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Sawinski. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Barrett.
Ms. Jaffer? You.
Nothing for me, thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Schomer, I'll let you address. I want to say with respect to Mr. Zawinski, I do say I'm going to encourage the applicant once again to do all it can to encourage multiple modes. I agree there's too much parking. I don't have a good solution, but I don't want and can't support a project that says, well, we're not going to advocate for the MBTA to stop in front of the spot because nobody takes the bus. That's a defeatist position. We need more bike space. We need more pedestrian accommodation. We need to save the stone wall. And we need to encourage people to take the bus to their destination. So I'm hoping to see all of that accommodated at some point. In terms of the vertical bike racks, They do save space. They actually work. I think you'll find them, if you haven't seen them, I think you'll find them to be quite nice and a good way to order the bikes. So I'd encourage the applicant to look at them. I think you probably need some ground bike racks as well, just because in order to use the vertical bike racks, people have to lift their bikes and not everybody can do that. But I think there's a lot to ponder in Mr. Zawinski's letter that I think go speak to livability and long-term health for the town of Milton as it attempts to meet its livability goals. But Mr. Schumer, I don't know if you have a reaction to Mr. Zawinski's testimony.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And before I move on to other topics, may I just say that I agree with what you've just said about multimodal. We're committed to that as well. If the board feels that there's excess parking on this site, that is something that could be conditioned for the project, that to reduce parking on the site.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. You know, I mean, we've heard the testimony on it. It's a tricky site because there aren't a lot of good options, unfortunately, and you don't want people to be parking in the neighborhood.
Yeah, you know, it's a tricky problem, and it's a regional problem as well. You know, who moves first? Do you take away the cars, or do you take away the requirement that they be parked somewhere? In terms of biking on this site, we can supplement our architectural plans with some more comprehensive drawings of the proposed bike storage, which we've actually already shared with Ms. Barrett previously. But in the garage, as it's currently designed, there is room for, my understanding is somewhere in the range of 90 to 100 bicycles. And if you do employ vertical storage of the bicycles in 2 locations of the garage, so there's a lot of room in that garage to fit a lot of bicycles in there, with some additional space for more horizontal spaces and wider spaces. So there's a lot of room in there, and we have put a lot of thought into that. So I thank Tim for his comments and feedback on that, and we have heard that and have it in mind as we design the site in more particular detail. On specifically, Mr. Chair, regarding the question of accessible units, my understanding is that the project is designed with 5% Group 2A accessible units. And I believe that is the requirement by law, that the project provide those accessible units. And if Dan Riggs is still on, he could perhaps further comment on that. In terms of providing more, and specifically more with a crossover with the affordable units, though the location and the specific units that are chosen as affordables, those are designated during the final approval process. So that's something we could certainly take up with Mass Housing when we go back to them for final approval. They typically like to see the affordable housing units mixed in terms of both the location of the site, so that they're not clumped in the same area, but also across the various unit types and sizes and bedroom counts. So they may have some thoughts on that, but it's certainly something worth investigating, I think, with Mass Housing. And I take that point as well. Just going through the list of my notes that I have here from when Mr. Zawinski was talking. Perhaps it would be helpful for us to supplement our architectural plans with a sheet providing better clarity of where all the sidewalks go and how that is programmed. I'm certainly happy to do that. In terms of dog walking and signage around the site, those are specific details I think would probably be appropriate for conditions, but perhaps this is something that we could talk with Tim about before the next meeting and see if he has any thoughts for specifics on details of that nature. So,
Okay.
Dan, did you have anything further to add on that question of accessible units?
No, I think you summarized it well. It's 5% Group 2A accessible units that are equitably distributed between the 1, 2, 3 bedroom unit types, and the locations of those would be marked later, as you mentioned. So yeah, that's all I have to add on that item. Thank you,
Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, Frank. I defer to you.
Jargon alert. Someone needs to tell me what Group 2A means.
So a group 2A unit is a unit that is designed for sort of full accessibility with regard to people with mobility disabilities. So wheelchair accessible, if you think of it that way. We'd also have a percentage of hearing impaired units within the project to meet fully meet code. So.
Thank you.
Just one further point, Mr. Chair, if I may, on Mr. Zawinski's suggestion of some sort of commemoration of the site history. I think that's a great idea. That's something we could certainly work with Mr. O'Donnell and the Historical Commission. I didn't respond to Mr. O'Donnell's comments, although I do appreciate them. We have tried to design the site in a way that is sensitive to the history, and I think that we have achieved that from a certain standpoint in terms of not just looking backwards with this site, but also looking forwards to providing affordable housing and market rate rental housing, both of which are really badly needed in the town of Milton. And I think that this proposal achieves that in a way that is sensitive to the design. We'd certainly be willing to meet with Mr. O'Donnell and his commission to see if they have any further ideas regarding preservation and specific programming for those sites at some point in the future. But those are specific details that we have not settled on at this point. I think that, Tim, if there's anything that I missed there that you'd like a response on now, please let me know. But I think that's it.
I think we're good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schomer. Mr. Kiernan.
Yes, my apologies. I think I was on the Zoom site twice. It was on my telephone, but I think I appeared twice and I was echoing.
No problem. Welcome to the board.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, sir. If I could just make a couple of brief points. The first one is, thank you for the opportunity to address the committee and members of the public. But I should state that I will be somewhat general in my discussion, because since we anticipate that there will be a notice of intent filed by the applicant before the commission, I'm in a position where I cannot prejudge something that we haven't seen yet. So if a comprehensive permit is issued, then we do expect a notice of intent to be filed under the State Wetlands Protection Act. So I don't want to prejudge anything, so I can only make general comments at this point. But they are essentially that our biggest concerns, those that would impact the resources which we're duty bound to protect. And the biggest concerns that we would have would be stormwater runoff and drainage issues. And these are affected both by surface flow as well as groundwater changes and shifts because of foundations, and particularly things like underground parking. And I know some of these have been already addressed, but those would be the concerns that we have because we're so close to an adjacent stream. And whether or not it's perennial or intermittent, we would still have jurisdiction. And our concerns would be primarily impervious surface. So to us, when I say us, I'm referring to the Conservation Commission, our concerns would be not just the ratio of impervious surface, but the actual, the numbers, the square footage of impervious surface. And it's going to affect the resource area, which is quite clear. So we're looking at not just surface flow discharge and underground and groundwater flow, but we're looking as to what would that surface water entail. And if we look at parking spaces, we're going to be looking at things like, what's in the surface discharge. And if you're parking cars there, we're going to have petroleum, we're going to have contaminants, and there has to be a mechanism to protect and control that. I know it can be done, and I know Jim Burke is very sensitive to that and is aware of it, but those are the things that we would require at a baseline minimum. Secondly, I should say that the presentation by Steve O'Donnell was very articulate, and many of those issues I think that we are aligned with the Conservation Commission. And I think primarily the point that he made, and I would reiterate, is that the site should should drive the design and not have the design shoehorned into a site. And in this particular one, we've got elevation concerns that drop directly to the stream. We've got runoff concerns that would put contaminants into the stream. We've got the removal of trees that would be of great concern to us. And that's in addition to, or I guess an adjunct to the concern with historic gardens in the area. And those are part of the resource that we protect. So again, generally speaking, our focus is going to be directly onto stormwater runoff and groundwater changes and the cleanliness of the groundwater discharge, and that relates directly to parking. The size of the parking area, particularly above ground, is going to be of great concern to us because there's a direct relationship between what's running off and the impervious surface. So where our focus is going to be on petroleum and contaminants that are coming off the parking areas. And again, these are general comments because we don't have a notice of intent filed to date, but those are the things that we'll be looking at very, very closely.
Thank you, Mr. Kiernan. You know, when we started this hearing, we didn't expect an NOI to be submitted because they were outside of the jurisdiction. But the modifications to the project have now put this project into your jurisdiction. So we know that there'll be, to the extent of project advances and NOI filed. I'm particularly interested in the Conservation Commission's comfort level with the coordination of the work of the Board of Appeals, and that we're not working at cross purposes or doing something to interfere with your statutory process. So I don't know that that's as much of a question to you or a statement to you that I want the Conservation Commission to know that we as a board are sensitive to that particular issue, given the fact that this is your expertise and not ours.
No, I appreciate that comment, whether it's a question or a statement. I appreciate them both.
Yeah.
I think that our jurisdiction was triggered initially, not because of the location of the footprint, but elevation changes.
Oh, okay.
Any alteration within the 100-foot jurisdictional line would trigger our jurisdiction. So I appreciate the fact that the design has changed somewhat. And again, the driving force for us is the footprint. And not just the footprint of the building, but the footprint of the impervious surface.
Right.
So I welcome the opportunity to work cooperatively with your board.
We've probably spent, half of our time speaking to the issues about which you mentioned. You just gave us a half a dozen bullet, and I've got bullets in my notes, issues, all of which have been discussed. So appreciate that. I have one more question. I'll ask the board if they've got questions. There's been some testimony about the town's, M4 permit and how that intersects with this. I wonder if that touches on your jurisdiction and you have a comment on that at all.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the what permit?
The town's M4 permit.
M4, I'll have to go back to something I've heard. It's a terminology question. The M4 permit, can you define that for me?
Well, I'm not an expert at it, but my understanding is the town has a permit with the US EPA about discharge offsite. Maybe Mr. Reardon could speak to it a little bit, much more clearly than I, but we're trying to unpack just some different jurisdictional issues. Mr. Reardon?
Sure. So first, it's called MS4 permit.
MS4, okay.
Yep. And what it is, it's the town operates a drainage system that discharges at multiple points to surface waters of the United States. So they have a permit with the federal government that regulates those discharges. As part of compliance with that permit, they put in place programs that manage all the people that contribute to it. So the town has a stormwater bylaw that is written in large part to comply with the MS4 permit. So our recommendation to the board is that they shouldn't be waiving anything that's in the stormwater bylaw because those conditions are specifically written to comply with the town's MS4 permit. To Mr. Kiernan's point, almost exclusively those issues deal with the quality of water that enters the drainage system so that the town can certify that the water that they're discharging from the town's drainage system to the waters, to the surface waters, it meets the standards. So, you know, those are very much part and parcel with the issues that you guys both have been discussing and the things that we've been discussing quite a bit recently on this project.
No, and thank you. And that would conform directly with the state standards under DEP and the mass contingency plan. So we're all heading in the same direction, I believe, on that one. So I appreciate it. It's not just volume of water, it's the quality of the water.
Fair enough.
And if I could add, Mr. Chair, you know, the things I refer to as the Massachusetts stormwater standards are kind of like the roadmap that all of the different bodies use for sort of normalizing that discussion. So the principles that we've been applying in our review for the ZBA are the very same principles that would apply for the Concom approval.
Thank you. Members of the board, questions for Mr. Kiernan? Mr. O'Brien?
No questions, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Jaffer?
I have a question.
Ms. Jaffer?
I think she's frozen, Mr. Chair.
Huh. Giselle, you were frozen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So, thank you, Mr. Kiernan, for your thoughts and for appearing today. One thing that you mentioned that we haven't covered, I think, at least in detail before, is the issue of contaminants potentially flowing into the stream, and understanding that you need to evaluate that in greater detail at some point in the future. What type of testing and or conditions do you typically recommend when that's a concern?
Well, I guess there's a twofold answer. The first one is, what do we do during the construction phase? Because that's extremely important to us. And as you know, the heavy equipment is often hydraulic, and those hydraulic hoses pop all the time. And so we've got spill protection plans that we always implement. And there are erosion protection, sedimentation protections, dewatering plans, all of which accompany the construction phase. So that's one aspect. That's step one. Step two is, after construction is completed, you know, how do we ensure that on an ongoing basis is an O&M plan, an operation and maintenance plan, to ensure that contaminants that continue after construction are addressed. And that would be the parking lot, where cars are constantly dropping oil and contaminants, gasoline. There are all kinds of things that flow off of cars and just drop to the pavement. And then the next rainstorm comes along and washes that all into our brooks and streams, and not just the drainage system where it's captured, but it also gets into the brooks and streams which run adjacent to this particular project. So we've got two approaches. One is construction phase, one is O&M as the, after the construction is completed and the certificate of occupancy is issued. They're both of concern to us, but both can be addressed. One with the sedimentation and erosion and contamination controls during construction, and the second one during construction. I'm sorry, after construction, during operation. One of the issues that we have is that after the developer and the contractor leaves, then what happens? Because then the folks move in and years go by, and all of a sudden we've got issues, but we can't go back to the developer, we can't go back to the applicant because they're no longer on site. So we have to have some kind of an O&M plan that continues with the then current owners. And it changes. Sometimes they're rental units, sometimes they're condominiumized, and sometimes they're owner, sometimes there is an HOA. But in any event, we need to have some future control as to what happens, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 25 years from now. I'm not sure that answers your question, but we do look at it with both current situation and future situation.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you. You heard Mr. O'Donnell reference the removal of trees, and we've talked about that quite a bit too. From the Conservation Commission's perspective, are there certain types of trees in particular that should be preserved with the understanding that we always want to preserve trees?
That's the predicate assumption. We try to preserve the trees. I mean, and not just for the natural beauty, but also for the water control, because the root systems do absorb the water and prevent runoff and prevents erosion. No, we typically don't distinguish between what kind of trees we'd like to save all of them. Obviously, we cannot. However, we do have a performance standard, which requires that the applicant, the developer, has to replace trees in a particular ratio. And we're actually in the midst of changing our regulation. We have been on a 3-to-1 basis, 1 tree removed, 3 trees replaced. Now, obviously, you can't do that with respect to all trees. I mean, you replace a tree, it's going to be somewhere 3 or 4 or 5 inches in caliber or diameter. Right now, we're in the process of shifting, and we will present to the select board a new regulation in which we're looking at, we call it DBH, or a diameter at breast height or circumference at breast height. And what we're looking for is the sum of the circumferences of all the trees removed to be replaced. So that if you take 3, and again, it gets a little confusing because people shift back and forth between diameter and circumference. But if we use, one standard, if you take a tree with a 20-inch circumference, then you'd have to replace that. If you take, 3 trees with that circumference, you'd have to replace the sum of that circumference. So we do have a performance standard. And for the last 29 years, we've used a 3-to-1 ratio. We're trying to be a little bit more specific so that the size of the tree is replaced under our new performance standard. But we're very concerned with the removal of trees, and we do insist that those trees be replaced. Now, sometimes the site can't accommodate that because the site's too small. So therefore, we have I call it a virtual tree bank, so that applicants, developers will have to put into a virtual tree bank either a credit or an agreement to fund replacement of trees elsewhere. And the town has the discretion to put trees elsewhere. We could put them on school property. We've done a lot of that at Turner's Pond. We've taken from the tree bank to put into public land. So there is a way to do that. We won't be foreclosed simply because the site is not large enough to replace all the trees that have been removed.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I'll direct this to you. I think it would be helpful to have the Conservation Commission's opinions prior to our drafting of the conditions. So not sure exactly what triggers that, a notice of intent or just an invitation from us to give a more thorough review. But I think that would be important because we do, to your point, seem to be a little out of step with some of their requirements that we've already been discussing. Thank you.
Yeah. Fair enough. Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, Mr. Kiernan, and thank you for your longtime service to the community and the Conservation Commission. I know that you guys get as much as we get for our service here, so I appreciate that. In terms of your activities regarding, it sounds like you require essentially construction management plans on a fairly frequent basis when it comes to the issues under your purview.
That is correct. And sometimes we even require a bond.
Typically, how much of a bond is required, and what are the circumstances that surround the issuance of a bond?
In truth, the bonds are infrequent. We have done it in the past, so there is precedent for it. Generally speaking, we do not. If it's a large project, I'll give you an example. I think we required one on the repaving of Route 28, Randolph Avenue. But it would generally be a large project where we anticipated some issues. If a single home owner came in, it would be unusual to have a bond. But on a larger project, it would be more common.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. I appreciate your being here. And again, thank you for your help.
Oh, certainly welcome.
You good, Frank?
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kiernan. I think that concludes thank you for your time and your testimony. I think that concludes the town's testimony. Is that right, Mr. Zawinski? I'll take that as a yes.
Apologies, Mr. Chair.
Oh.
You're correct. That's the end of our testimony.
Okay, thank you. Let me, so mindful of the time, I know what the board's pleasure is. Mr. Reardon, I'd like to hear from Mr. Reardon as to the stormwater, his reaction to the stormwater submittal. And but perhaps before we do that, we give the applicant an opportunity to complete his supplemental testimony regarding the status of the application, to which Mr. Reardon may respond. Mr. Schomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I asked Jim to come on and speak to his recent activities. The off-site testing that we have done for the drainage stream behind the property and the town's municipal drainage infrastructure in Meeting House Lane, as well as the town's sewer infrastructure in Meeting House Lane, is outlined in the first part of my letter. Perhaps if Jim has some further updates of that, he could elaborate.
Thank you, Jesse, and good evening, everybody. Jim Burke with DeSalle Burke Sala. And making note of the time, I would say that Mr. Reardon and I would have gone back and forth. We had that opportunity with the meeting that we had offline, if you will, that I think we made some really good headway with regards to approach and presentation with regards to calculations for stormwater control on-site and off-site. So I think that we've done our best to make sure that the stormwater management standards have been met for the property and the project. And we also did our best to show that these implementations of the stormwater control and how they impacted off-site infrastructure and how they actually work. I think that the models that we provided Mr. Reardon, I think are accurate, and honestly, I look forward to his review. And if we have any additional minor little issues that we have to take care of, we're prepared to do that. So I'd open it up to Mr. Reardon at this point.
Mr. Reardon.
So good evening, everybody. And as Sean Reardon with Tetra Tech, ZBA's review consultant for civil issues. As Jim mentioned, they did do quite a bit of work recently. And I think what I'd like to do is sort of break the stormwater up into two sort of concepts. One is there's on-site stormwater, which is the site's treating of stormwater and dealing with the issues that Mr. Kiernan mentioned and things like that. But there's also the issues of off-site stormwater, which is principally the things that were discussed at our last hearing that the neighborhood brought up, all the concern related to the stream that traverses those properties to our south, or I guess it may be to our east. But the lower sections that have the stream, and also the infrastructure that serves Meeting House Lane. So as it relates to the on-site stormwater, we've obviously been dealing with that for quite a long time. I think Jim is finally demonstrated that he's got a design that can meet the standards and can provide the necessary water quality treatment that Mr. Kiernan referenced, as well as providing the required recharge volumes, as well as maintaining the adequate offsets to groundwater, and then meeting the pre versus post development requirements. So I think the on-site stormwater is in a pretty good position. It's a very complicated system, multiple pieces. So we'll have to keep track of that throughout the process and make sure it gets done the way it's been referenced. But at this point, I think we're at a good spot with regard to their demonstration of compliance with the standards. Related to off-site stuff, there was a lot of discussion about that last time. And We asked Jim to take a look at all of the area that contributes to those two systems. There are two systems that ultimately serve the site. There's the large intermittent stream that runs next to the Delphi property and through the abutters on Meeting House Lane. There's also the drainage infrastructure that is collected from Meeting House Lane. So there's two places downstream where the water from the site goes. And though the site is a small portion of the area that is served by those two things. So what we asked the applicant to do is look at the overall drainage area, get an understanding for how that works, and describe to us how the project fits within that larger system. So to that point, Jim did a watershed analysis of those two systems that demonstrated, first of all, it was a lot of work and it was well done. So I appreciate the effort that went into it. And after we took a really hard look at it and had some dialogue with Jim and worked through some things that looked odd to us, but we eventually came to the conclusion that the net result is that the project will actually reduce the burden on the downstream systems. And for a couple reasons. It might sound a little odd, but the reason it does is number one is the site has a lot of detention and a lot of recharge, so that the net result is that their peak discharge is significantly lower in some of the larger storms. But the real tangible benefit comes from, because their system is so complicated, it takes a lot of time to get through it. And what happens is it delays the addition of the stormwater from the site until a point where after the peak of the larger system happens. So in effect, all the complications and nuances of the site design, it slows down the water from getting off the site so that peak doesn't coincide with the other system peaks that currently happen. So I can say with a fair level of confidence, and based on the modeling that Jim provided, that I think the project will not exacerbate conditions downstream. That being said, Jim's model also does indicate that there are capacity issues downstream. So, it validated a lot of the points that the neighbors made and the concerns that they had, that it sort of proved that out. But the project will not exacerbate that condition.
Mr. Reardon, does that conclude your testimony?
It does related to stormwater. I had some other comments related to sewer and groundwater and site construction. If you want to get into that, or if you'd rather defer that, I can certainly.
No, please.
So we also talked at the last meeting about the sewer, in particular, Mr. Gallagher's property down at 45 Alfred Road. We haven't gotten too much information from the applicant on that. There was some dialogue between the town and their sewer consultant that suggested that there might be some downstream issues that need to be addressed. Those can probably be addressed pretty easily in a condition. One thing I would say is there is quite a bit of new flow coming down Meeting House Lane. The Meeting House Lane sewer is adequate to handle that, but it reaches a point at the bottom of confluence with other systems where there are some constrictions. That being said, the project is going to have a pretty significant II requirement, and II is a term that refers to inflow and infiltration. And what that refers to is, when you have sewer systems, it usually isn't the dirty water that causes problems. It's the clean water that comes in from the rain or from the groundwater that causes capacity issues. So the inflow and infiltration requirements are requirements that projects have to do to mitigate that clean water that's getting into the system and thereby freeing up capacity for the dirty water. The project will have to pay almost $200,000 in II fees through the town's program, which are predicated on a sort of a 4-to-1 removal ratio. So in effect, the project will be funding II removal that creates capacity of in excess of 3 times their expected contribution. So I can feel pretty comfortable that the project, again, as a entity on its own, is going to result in a net benefit to the system, provided that they follow through with their II obligations. As it relates to groundwater, a lot of discussion on groundwater last time. we still haven't received much, if any, information on groundwater. It was expressed to us that the plan, at least for the garage, is to have a watertight foundation so that they wouldn't have an active dewatering system. My opinion on that is, in all likelihood, having a watertight foundation that extends into the groundwater table is likely going to create some impacts, but they're going to be relatively modest in relationship to the offsite properties. The largest impact will probably be felt on-site upstream of the foundation, where the water table will probably go up. But there are no stormwater mitigation elements up there. So in a way, that's probably not a bad thing. So I still think there's some detail and some explanation that we'd like to get from the applicant on what their proposed measures are, and in an opinion as to what the likely impacts will be to groundwater table. But I would expect those things would be managed easily. And then finally, going back to the same issues we did before, we think we're finally at a point where, yeah, the systems work. Now it's a question of, well, can they be built safely? So we still have quite a few outstanding questions as to how practically the image that's been drawn can be achieved and be achieved safely. Such things as a crane location. I would assume that they're going to be using a crane to construct this. Cranes have topple height requirements, because if they fall, they got to be able to fall in a safe place. I don't know where that safe place would be, because there's not a lot of places to put it. Same thing with contractor parking. There's not a whole lot of place left for people to park on site. So certainly wouldn't want them parking in Meeting House Lane. Like to know that there's a plan for that. And similarly, we don't know how materials would get managed or delivered. Last thing we want to do is have trucks queued in Blue Hill Avenue waiting to offload equipment, or hopefully not, just dumping it at the side of the road because there's no other place to put it. And then also Mr. Kieran mentioned about perimeter controls. Right now, the plan only has a hay bale silt fence line around the site. We would expect there to be some sort of construction fence or some other perimeter controls that protect both the site from the community and the community from the site. So these are all things that, in my mind, sort of need to be fleshed out in order to make the board feel comfortable that there's a plan in place to make sure that this work is done safely. And that concludes my comments, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Reardon, when you say complicated on-site system, that makes me a little bit nervous with respect to future maintenance. Have you had experience with applicants posting some type of collateral to ensure that? I know we spoke about an operation and maintenance plan, but that's only as good as the entity that is serving it. What about posting of some type of a security in the way of a bond or something like that?
Possible, very infrequently used, and I think that's probably a mistake, because to your point, it's very easy to sort of construct and forget stuff. I wouldn't say that the elements themselves aren't terribly complicated. The interconnection of all the pieces are complicated. So it's not like there's any sort of new or fancy systems. There's just a lot of them, and they're sort of staged across the site because there's no big common area to use.
Yeah, it feels to me critical in a lot of ways. So I wanted to ask that question, but thank you. Let me ask some members if they've got a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Reardon. You mentioned that you haven't received much information about groundwater. I guess, what type of information do you typically receive, or would you like to receive in this instance? And then secondly, you said that maybe the biggest potential risk is an on-site upstream groundwater issue. And what does that mean? Does that mean flooding on site?
So the first question was, actually, what was the first question? I'm sorry.
What type of information do you typically receive?
So typically we don't ask for a lot of information related to groundwater. We rely on compliance with the standards to drive that. This case is pretty unique because of the percentage of the site that is occupied by a structure that extends into the groundwater. And the comments that the community have raised through their consultant. I'm not a hydrogeologist, so a little bit outside my depth. I think the questions that have been asked warrant at least something put on the record by the applicant to substantiate what their thoughts are. And it could be as simple as define what your dewatering system is for your foundation, and then forecast what, if any, impacts come from that. We have been told that the sort of bathtub approach is what's going to be used for the proposed system, as opposed to some active dewatering system. So what if you can imagine, that foundation would act kind of like a dam, and I don't want to say it just blocks the natural flow of water as it moves through the ground downhill. The reason I said it would be felt worse at the high side of the building is because, as you can imagine, if you stuck your hand in a rivulet of water, the water pools up in front of your hand, similar as the foundation. So I would be concerned if, for example, we had all this work done where we forecasted what the groundwater was and made sure that their infiltration systems had adequate separation, but then they went and did something that actually raised the groundwater beneath them and sort of marginalized their performance. In this case, we would expect that higher groundwater not to breach the surface, but it might raise the groundwater a foot, may raise it 18 inches. There are models that can forecast that. And we think it's a good idea for the applicant to go on record with what their expectations are.
Great, thank you. And I know I asked a compound question. Maybe you answered the second already, but you referred to on-site upstream impact. So I was wondering if that means flooding on the site.
No, it doesn't. What it means is a raise in the groundwater table on the upstream side of the building foundation.
Okay, and is that a bad thing?
No, in this case, it's not a bad thing because there's nothing in front that would be marginalized from it happening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Reardon, for your work on this and for your continuing education on these issues. You characterize this proposed stormwater management system as complicated, and then delineated it as perhaps the individual structures, the various things that Mr. Burke has laid out for us, the various chambers and whatnot, the holding chambers, not so complicated in and of themselves. The complication comes more from, well, explain to me, where does the complication come from?
The sheer number of components. So typically on a project site, you'd have maybe a single, maybe two recharge systems. In this case, we have a combination of at-grade detention. We have a combination of below-grade detention, multiple infiltration systems at multiple different levels. So the all traditional pieces, but I've never worked on a project where we had this many so tightly connected and woven at different elevations and sort of placed into corners at different groundwater offsets. So it's a unique system from my standpoint, and it largely driven by the site constraints that there was no option for a large system. There was no option for even a mid-size system. You had to work within the space that you had, and you had to spread things throughout the site. Which I want to say, it's not necessarily a bad thing because it provides a certain level of redundancy. It slows the water down, which is a good thing, as I mentioned earlier. But it is a complicated system, and to the chairman's point, it's going to need to be tightly watched to make sure it functions as intended.
So complicated to build, complicated to maintain. I assume that it's going to take a fair amount of care and special attention to be built. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. All of the above, yes.
Does complication, well, generally speaking, in the engineering world, isn't the more complicated a system, the more prone it is to potential failure?
I would say I wouldn't say in this case it's more prone to potential failure. I think it's more prone to misconstruction or not realizing what was intended because of the difficulty in construction. But I don't think that the pieces are not complicated in and of themselves and are maintainable in and of themselves, but very easy for sections to get overlooked. So for example, if people aren't diligent, they may go out there and think they did their maintenance on the entire system when they took care of 4 sections, not realizing that there's 9 sections. So I think the complication comes from the sheer number of components and the atypical nature of that in comparison to other systems.
Is there sufficient redundancy built into the system if there is I don't know, stuff goes wrong all the time. Something gets stuck somewhere or something like that. I mean, I'm not suggesting a major failure, but or is there sufficient redundancy to what happens, and no matter what you do, what you build, is there sufficient redundancy to handle the oh my God factor?
Yeah, I do. And in the oh my God factor is built in anyway, because we as engineers know there's always going to be a storm that's bigger than what we designed for. So there are overflows in every component. There are ways for flows to bypass in case something fails. So there are protections in place, yes.
So I assume that ongoing maintenance will be absolutely critical to this. Would that maintenance be, would you characterize the system as complicated and somewhat of almost, if I could borrow a phrase, almost a custom job, but is the maintenance itself complicated, expensive, intensive?
Not terribly, no. If not done properly, the cumulative effects can make it so. But if it's done according to plan and there is an operation and maintenance plan that dictates when maintenance gets done, then it shouldn't be a problem.
You had also mentioned some concerns regarding, if you will, construction management plan type issues that are associated with the site, things like that. Is there a substantial danger that the installation of this system could be disrupted or damaged in some way, shape, or form through a mishap during construction?
I don't know about a mishap as much as, so one of the real important pieces of the system is the infiltration basins. And these are the portions of the system that allow the water to go into the ground. We see very frequently that during the course of construction, the soils underneath these systems are over compacted and they basically turn what was good permeable soils into basically impervious soils because they've been compacted so much. So what we really need to do is to make sure during the course of construction that these areas that are intended for infiltration don't get used for temporary settling during construction, don't get used for heavy traffic, get protected during construction.
My colleague, Ms. Joffrey, asked a question that I was going to ask concerning groundwater, and I thank her for that and for your answer regarding that. Do the pieces of infrastructure that are going to be put in place for this have any potential impact or potentially exacerbate any issues in your view relative to groundwater? And I say that simply because you seem to make the point that this thing is going to be there's going to be a lot of stuff in the ground. And if it's one thing I've learned from listening to all you folks is that when you put stuff in the ground, it disrupts, and water is going to find a way in, around, or through stuff.
Correct. So I think the best way to answer that is the general consensus throughout stormwater is it's a good thing to put stormwater into the ground to get it to recharge, because the ground provides a lot of benefits to managing pollution in stormwater. Might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but the ground is a great filter. The ground treats stormwater, so we'd much rather have it go into the ground and get to the streams through the ground than over the surface. If it travels over the surface, it picks up all sorts of bad things on the way, nutrients, all sorts of trash. So we'd much rather have stormwater generated on site infiltrate into the ground. Also, as a percentage of the water body, for lack of a better word, the amount of water that we're recharging into the ground in comparison to the volume of water that's in the ground and flowing through the ground is so small that any impacts that the site would have would get subsumed within the larger water table far more seamlessly than they would get subsumed within a surface conveyance. So for that purpose, we would always rather see it go into the ground because we expect the impacts to be modest. Most of our concern related to determining what the impacts on groundwater are more predicated on, will those changes impact our ability to recharge? So for example, the reason we want to maintain a separation from groundwater is so that the recharge components of our stormwater system are reliable and can perform, for a long time. Not because we have any concern that of impacts to the groundwater table.
So I have some additional questions regarding some of the sewer stuff, but to sum up, as you articulated to me and to the board several weeks ago, the system is going to have to meet the stormwater standards. So to repeat, it's your opinion that as designed at the current time, it meets the applicable stormwater standards and will work as designed.
If it doesn't meet it right now, any modifications that we request are kind of rote, and we wouldn't imagine that they change the design fundamentally. So there may be a few minor details that we have to work out, but we're 99% of the way there.
Thank you. Moving on to the, you seem to indicate, at least in your comments, seem to indicate to me that you have some concerns with capacity issues of the sewer line all the issues surrounding Mr. Gallagher and 45 Alfred Road, and that there is some constriction there. Could you care to elaborate a little bit more on what your concerns might be?
Sure. So at the bottom of the hill, there's several different sewers that come and tie into one manhole. The geometry at that manhole has a lot of sort of turbulence because the way the different pipes connect at that manhole, which makes it not function very well, and could be fixed with some geometry changes. And again, this is based on the limited information that I have, so I could be mistaken here, but this is my interpretation of the information that I've seen to date. So there are things downstream that in an ideal world wouldn't be there, and with new flow, the situation could get worse if it wasn't addressed. So there's that issue. And then there's just an overall capacity concern that Weston and Sampson mentioned in their correspondence with the town that warranted some additional investigation on their part, which I would support. That being said, the project has obligations to offset problems in the system already at a 4-to-1 rate. So from my perspective, there's a consideration in the project already to mitigate their additional sewer flows that we need to be conscious of. In that those expenditures should probably be made within the area downstream of the site. The other thing I'd add is they did find out that there were no SSOs, so there have been no sanitary sewer overflows on record. I believe the information that I reviewed was the problems at Mr. Gallagher's home were related to a collapsed sewer lateral, which is their connection into the system. So it wasn't generated based on a system shortfall. It was based on a sort of a connection problem.
Thank you, Mr. Reardon, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes my questions at this point in time.
Okay, let me, one comment there. As I understand the II program, it's not a trust fund. So it's not necessarily that the mitigation money is going to go to mitigate the harm that this has caused, right? Isn't it a townwide account that the town elects to do the offsite work as it's scheduled? I thought that's what Mr. Berkeley had said when we were walking on Meeting House Lane this winter.
It is. So the premise being is that the project is going to add a portion of new flow to the system.
Right.
They are going to have to make a contribution or pay a fee, offset that new flow by taking other flow out of the system. That's the inflow and infiltration. So my comment was that by paying that fee, they are in effect reducing other flows at a 4-to-1 ratio to the new flow that they're adding. Now, that to your point, there's no guarantee unless the board requires it, that those improvements will get made in the areas that are downstream of the project. But we would trust that the town would focus those funds in the areas that provide the best benefit, and they're the most qualified to determine whether there might be something somewhere else that's more of a concern.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it was a pretty powerful board, but I don't think we can force the town to do that. I don't think so, but that's okay. I just want to note that for the record so that if, for people following along, it's not as if what we're doing is we're demanding that we set aside some money to fix this offsite issue. That's not happening. There will be money that might potentially fix the offsite issue depending upon the town's priorities. That's
Yeah, and I'd add to that there's an offsite concern. There's not, we haven't had any documentation that suggests it's an issue. My recommendation to the board would be prior to create sort of a condition that prior to issuing a building permit, the applicant would have to work with the town sewer consultant to confirm the new flow is not going to be an issue.
Okay. Mr. Reardon, are you going to be supplementing your written report with the testimony that you offered tonight?
I can if you'd like, certainly.
I think it'd be helpful. Ms. Barrett has been asked to keep track of the conditions, and I think your testimony is sufficiently complicated to help us all. So I appreciate that. Mr. Bowman has had his hand raised.
It's
He's patiently waiting. Mr. Bowman.
Thanks. Sean, your point about the bathtub style of foundation and how that can, what I heard was somewhat unpredictable impact on groundwater level. And that being the case, with the subsurface infiltration structures, how do you know what grade to set those structures at if you're not sure where the water table is?
Well, that's why I was mentioning that we would expect the raise in the water table to happen on the upstream side of the building. So on the Blue Hill Avenue side of the building, all of the stormwater mitigation is on the downhill side of the building. So what we would expect to see is sort of a change in the conditions above the building, but not so much below the building.
Okay.
You all set, Mr. Bowman?
That was my question.
Okay.
And there are other issues associated with that kind of foundation, but they have more to do with uplift and leakage and.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Any further questions from the board? Okay, Mr. Schomer, you have some, a little bit of homework from tonight, but assuming that you'd be in a position to address that homework at the next hearing.
I believe we will, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hill, I know that it's customary of the board to offer you an opportunity to comment and to offer the neighbors an opportunity to ask questions, but given the hour and given the fact that you're marked up for the next hearing at which we have devoted the entire hearing to hear from the neighbors, I wonder if it might be more beneficial if we opt to do that at this point.
That's fine, Mr. Chairman. I had a whole list of questions and comments to make on stormwater and hydrology, and but I can make those next week.
Yeah, I think that would be, I would appreciate that, I'll say. I don't know if I'll speak for the other members. And what I just, given the hour, I'm reluctant to start an entire new line of testimony, particularly given the fact that our next week's hearing will be dominated by what you want to offer, you and of course the neighbors offer. So we'll devote that. I will say, I'm going to ask at the top of the meeting for Mr. Schomer to respond to several of the issues that came up today. I also think it would be helpful, Mr. Schomer, if you could, several of your positions relate to requesting that the board condition the permit. I think it might be helpful to prepare a document that only has the conditions in it that you would find acceptable. That would be a good working document for me, and I think Ms. Barrett might appreciate that as well. I'm not suggesting one way or the other that the board finds any of the conditions acceptable, but I do think it would be helpful to have them all in one place. I think, so if we could do that, and I'm not asking for that at the next meeting, I'm telling you, giving you that I think that would be helpful at a subsequent date. I'll also say, so the next week, what I would expect is hear from the applicant on some follow-up testimony, give us an indication of when the final plans will be submitted. And then Mr. Hill, I'll take back what I said before. I was not going to permit you a sir rebuttal, but I think I need to give you the opportunity to supplement whatever testimony you offer next week with an opportunity to supplement that to the extent that it needs to be modified by additional materials that Mr. Schumer and the applicant provide. Fair enough?
It is, Mr. Chairman. And if I may make just two brief procedural points, just because they're time sensitive. The first is that a big part of the discussion earlier tonight from Mr. Schomer was that we can't reduce the density any further. We're at our breaking point with 86 units. And I think you heard a lot of testimony from Mr. Bomer and others that if the density was reduced, if the intensity of the use of the site was shrunk, I think this project would fit a lot better. This really goes to a procedural point that I'm not sure the board is aware of, that under the 40B regulations, you have the right to put this to the applicant to say, if you can't reduce the density further, if you can't address our concerns, then you have to prove to us that our proposed conditions would render the project uneconomic. Because that's kind of what you heard tonight from Mr. Schomer, that this project can't be reduced in size. So I would just suggest that you think about, as this hearing is coming to the end point, to try to set aside some time to present proposed conditions to the applicant that the applicant may not like, and then you can force the applicant to produce to you an uneconomic analysis. In other words, a pro forma that the applicant will argue shows that the conditions are uneconomic, and then you can have that peer reviewed by somebody who's an expert at economics of projects to give you some feedback as to whether that's correct or not. So I just raised that because it takes time, and it generally takes a month or so to get a pro forma from an applicant and then have that peer reviewed by an expert, if that's something that the board wanted to do as we get close to the end of the hearing. The regulations specifically allow for it. The cost of the peer review has to be paid for by the applicant. And so I just want to raise that point. And then the other procedural point is just on this post-permit conditions. You know, Mr. Schomer has said he's willing to accept the post-permit conditions to review the construction management plan. The trash plan came up tonight. That was actually supposed to be filed by tonight. So now we're hearing it may not be filed at all until after the permit. That's problematic because the HAC decisional law says you can't put a condition on a permit requiring the applicant to submit something later that's subject to a discretionary approval. It's called a condition subsequent. And this case law, which I can give you, that expressly prohibits this. And in the case that Mr. Schomer cited in his letter is distinguishable. It was a Brookline case from 2011. I'm familiar with it because it was my case. And the condition, the appeals court said some conditions are okay, but only if it's to review a plan for consistency with a permit. That's not the issue here. You wouldn't be looking at a construction management plan later for consistency with the permit. You want to know, is this project even viable now? As Mr. Reardon said, I think there's some foundational questions as how this project's going to get built. So there's a distinction between a simple check the box type of plan review after the permit's been issued and these real foundational issues that you cannot condition as a review after the permit's been issued. So I just want to make that procedural point as well.
Thank you, Mr. Hill.
Thank you.
Further business in front of the Board of Appeals tonight? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to recess this hearing until a week from tonight. That will be June 30. Is that right? June 30, 7 p.m. Same Zoom sign in, and we'll continue the hearing at that time. Thank you all for your cooperation tonight.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Good night now.
Good night.